Try and throw it all together. One syllable, I guess that would be. 616 will bear invitation song tonight. Mansions over the hilltop.
Thank you, Stephen. If you would tonight, let's open our Bibles to Exodus chapter 7. We've got a lot of territory to cover. We're going to deal with the first 9 plagues, make some applications. We'll save the 10th plague for next Sunday night. But beginning in verse 1 of Exodus chapter 7. And the Lord said unto Moses, See, I have made thee a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron thy brother shall be thy prophet. Thou shalt speak all that I command thee, and Aaron thy brother shall speak unto Pharaoh, that he send the children of Israel out of his land. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh shall not hearken unto you, that I may lay my hand upon Egypt, and bring forth mine armies, and my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt, by great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I stretch forth mine hand upon Egypt, and bring out the children of the Lord, or bring out the children of Israel from among them. And Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded them, so did they. And Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 years old, when they spake unto Pharaoh. Now there are several things here that I want us to consider. Number 1 is that God is going to stretch forth his hand against Egypt, to smite Egypt. And the reason God is doing that is so that they may know that I am the Lord. And that's an important statement. The second thing that I see here that's really important tonight is that look at the age. You know, some of the greatest works that's ever been done in the world was accomplished by people of an elderly age. I mean, when we start looking at Moses, we know that he's 80 years old. His brother's older than he is. And yet they are like God before Pharaoh. And the reason that they are like a God before Pharaoh is because of the wonders and signs that they're doing by the one true God. But this is really important because God is waging a war against Egypt. And God is even hardening Pharaoh's heart, making things more difficult, but ultimately he will let them go. Now let's look at the first plague, which is found in verse 19. And the Lord spake unto Moses, say unto Aaron, Take thy rod and stretch out thine hand upon the waters of Egypt, upon their streams, and upon their rivers, and upon their ponds, and upon all their pools of water, that they may become blood, and that there may be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. Now I'm going to kind of just summarize some of these things and not read all of it to you, but imagine how massive the Nile River is. And that entire river has been turned to blood. The Nile River was like a god to the Egyptians because it contained many necessities: drinking water, bathing water, water to wash pans and things, also food, fish, other meats from the water. So it was a necessity of life. And not only does God touch the pond or the river, but the ponds and the streams. And Pharaoh isn't going to be moved by this because guess what? Jannes and Jambres, which we can find in the letter to Timothy, Paul reveals who they are. But we see that they too turned water into blood. Now there's not going to be any drinking vessels, so they go and they dig. And they try to find springs down in the ground that's uncontaminated. But everywhere they dug, the water was still blood. And they could not drink it. And what's more, it stank. Fish died. I mean, this would be a horrible thing. I remember I was in school at the time of the Murray building being bombed. And I'm going to say the first week after, all the way from the Murray building to our campus, OU campus, was this horrific stench. And I didn't put two and two together initially, but I remember telling one of the professors, I said, "What is that stench?" He said, "That is the smell of dead bodies at the Murray building." It was terrible. And it was something I couldn't get out of my mind and out of my nostrils. And I am sure that during Pharaoh's time, this was a tremendous blow, even though Jannes and Jambres did the same thing. Let's go to the next plague. It's in chapter 8, verse 2. And if thou refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all thy borders with frogs. Now, when I first read this as a kid, I thought, this isn't such a big deal. We'll just have a big old, basically a frog fry, cook up some frog legs, and we'll just be eating all those frogs. But the frogs was far worse than me as a child could comprehend. I mean, the frog is also one of the gods among the Egyptians. It's on the headset just like the cobra. But these frogs would be in their living quarters. You know, everywhere they went, there was frogs everywhere. You couldn't walk without stepping on a frog. And I can tell you, as a country kid, I remember many a sleepless night, laying in the bed, curtains off the hooks, windows pushed all the way open, trying to get some cool night air. And all night, all you could hear was ribbit, ribbit, ribbit. And so this would be something that would get on their nerves, and they wouldn't be able to sleep or rest. And, you know, frogs are pretty nasty. They get, pardon my French, dung everywhere. I mean, there's just all kinds of things with the frogs. Let's go on to the next plague. Look in verse 16 of chapter 8. And the Lord said unto Moses, Say unto Aaron, Stretch out thy rod and smite the dust of the land, that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. Now, an interesting thing in some of the studies that I've made, some people say that this is not the lice we're familiar with. Some say this is simply gnats. Now, I've never been of that persuasion, but I thought I should throw it out there, since in many theological centers, they're teaching that it was a plague of gnats. And I can tell you that gnats are a nuisance. I mean, they get in your food, your nose, your eyes, especially when they're swarming, in your ears. It's like you are just tormented by them. But I've always just accepted the King James Version that it was lice. And one of the dreadful things as a kid, I remember there were certain kids in our school that had head lice. And you didn't get around them because they had eggs, and you'd get it too. And my sister got it from one of her best friends. And I can remember Mom washing her hair with something, and it just stank so bad. And I don't know what they used back when we were kids. But at any rate, it was horrible. And I guess their heads itch and hurt and everything like that. And if it was a plague of lice similar to that, this is really something against their priest, because they were to have no imperfections, nothing like lice or anything like that. They would be unclean. And so this is a terrible plague against them. But there's something more to it than this. I want you to look down in verse 19, if you would. Remember, so far the magicians have been performing everything that Moses did, which caused Pharaoh's heart to be hardened, and that he's like, well, that's no big deal. My magicians can do this. This is a trick. But look here. Then the magician said unto Pharaoh, This is the finger of God. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he hearkened not unto them as the Lord had said. Now see, they were unable to bring forth the lice. They've been able to perform every trick so far but this one, and we're only into the third plague. So even they, and consider this, these magicians are not like David Copperfield. These magicians were actually priests and the learned, if that's the way you pronounce it. They were the most educated men in all of Egypt, highly respected. And they were the consummate sum of knowledge. And so for them to say this is truly the finger of God, that should have been something that would have made Pharaoh get attention or take notice. But instead, his heart was hardened. Look at verse 21. Else if thou wilt not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies upon thee, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, and into thy houses, and the houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground whereupon they are. But notice verse 22, and I will sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end that thou mayest know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. Now there's going to be discrimination given here. Can you imagine just same area of the world, flies are swarming the Egyptians, but not a fly in the house of the Israelites in the land of Goshen? And flies are pesky things, aren't they? Here's what happened to me just Friday. I was walking into what I call my hot lab, and in flies with me a fly. And I'm on the third floor. And I'm like, how did that fly get up here? And I tried to shoo him out, and every time I shooed him, he'd go the opposite way, and eventually he flew out of my room to go pester someone else. But we don't like flies, do we? If you're having a meal and a fly lands on your food, do you pick that piece up and eat it? Most people discard it. They're like, man, who knows what that fly did on my food just now? Flies are known to vomit on stuff to break that down so they can eat it. And they too tend to be like the frogs and give dung on what they land on. So we don't like flies. We know they can lay their eggs and then you get the parasites. So flies are pesky. And imagine the swarms of them, and only in the house of Pharaoh. And I want you to look at verse 23 for a moment. Not only does he say, I will put a division between my people and thy people, tomorrow shall be this sign. Now this is a prediction or prophecy, isn't it? To prove that the Lord is truly the God of heaven and earth. So the Lord did so, verse 24, and there came a grievous swarm of flies into the house of Pharaoh, and into his servants' houses, and into all the land of Egypt. The land was corrupted by reason of the swarm of flies. Now, because of this, Pharaoh is going to offer a compromise. Look at verse 25. And Pharaoh called for Moses and for Aaron, and said, Go ye, sacrifice to your God in the land. And Moses said, It is not meet so to do, for we shall sacrifice the abomination of Egyptians to the Lord our God. Lo, shall we sacrifice the abominations of the Egyptians before their eyes, and will they not stone us? Now this is logical. You know, let me say this tonight. There are supposed to be 80 gods in Egypt. And these 80 gods protect all the things that they love in life. And some of their gods are in the sky. Amun-Ra, the sun god. We know that they worship the moon. We know that they worship their cattle. Even today, there are people that worship the cattle. Over in India, they believe in reincarnation, And if you've been a good person, you'll come back as a cow. And that's sacred to them. That is the crowning achievement of life, to become a cow. Which we laugh at that, don't we? They worship the river. The river was corrupted. So God is hitting this blow against all that is sacred to them. And Pharaoh's like, well, I'm going to make a compromise. But Moses and Aaron basically say, we're going to be killing some animals that y'all worship. And will you not stone us? So they're not buying the first compromise. Look at the second compromise in verse 28. And Pharaoh said, I will let you go, that ye may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, only ye shall not go very far away. Entreat for me. Now, if they're not very far away, which means they can get mad all of a sudden and go out and round them all up, right? This is not something that is acceptable. So here comes the fifth plague. Let's go into chapter 9, verse 3. Behold, the hand of the Lord is upon thy cattle, which is in the field, upon the horses, and upon the donkeys, and upon the camels, and upon the oxen, and upon the sheep. There shall be a very grievous murrain. Now the plague of the cattle infected their eyes, and they end up dying. You can imagine again the stench that would be in the land, and against their God. You know, they worship the cattle. And so now the cattle are dead, they're dying. This is a terrific blow. Look at verse 5, there's another prediction. And the Lord appointed a set time, saying, tomorrow the Lord shall do this thing in the land. So again, there's prophecy given. But do you think Pharaoh listened? No. In verse 7, look at this. Pharaoh sent, and behold, there was not one of the cattle of the Israelites dead. Again, there is separation, discrimination. And the heart of Pharaoh was hardened. In other words, he became stubborn again, and he did not let the people go. So God brings forth a sixth plague. Look at verse 8. And the Lord said unto Moses and unto Aaron, take to you handfuls of ashes of the furnace, and let Moses sprinkle it toward the heaven in the sight of Pharaoh. And it shall become small dust in all the land of Egypt, and shall be a boil breaking forth with blains upon man, and upon beast, and upon the land of Egypt. Now the ashes he's talking about from the furnace is from an idolatrous god known as Typhon. And so again, God is striking against their gods that they worshiped. He throws the dust up in the air, and when it lands upon people, boils are formed. I remember as a kid having a boil. And I was staying at my grandmother's house at the time that it was the worst. And she put this stuff called black tar on this boil. It was on the back of my leg. And it brought it to a head. Then she said, I'm going to lance it. And I was like, what? She took out her pocket knife and she cut it and mashed it, and it hurt so bad, but it healed up. And for a long time I had a little scar there, but it went away or faded away. But it was one of the most horrible things I can remember. You couldn't sit because you'd feel it every time you sat down, and you get hot and sweaty, and it was worse. They're in the land of Egypt where it's very hot and dusty. So boils, again, is something against the priest. I mean, they are now unclean. And it was a sure enough what I would call terrible time for all the Egyptians. But guess what? There wasn't any in Israel having any problems with it. Look at verse 16, if you would, with me. And in very deed for this cause have I raised thee up, for to show in thee my power, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth. Again, God is saying, I'm going to prove to the world that I am the one true God. At that time, Egypt is, we might say, the industrial capital of the world. Commerce, pyramids, they've got everything going for them, gold and silver, powerful army. They have weapons. They were the first ones, they say, to cast weapons, but unfortunately their weapons were of bronze, which was a great thing because many of the other tribes had weapons of copper, which was soft. But then along comes the Romans, who have weapons of iron. And he that has the greatest weapons is usually the greatest company, right? Or country. That's one thing that bothers me, and I think a lot of people in America. Let me just share something with you for a moment. We as Americans have become arrogant. We think we are the number one country in the world, and I think that. But in reality, whatever country is the most industrial nation is truly the number one power because they're controlling the commerce. You know who is the number one industrial country in the world right now? China. And we think that Russia is sort of, secondhand. They have more nuclear weapons and even more advanced nuclear weapons than we do in America. And we see all this false propaganda that Ukraine is winning the war. I saw last week where 60,000 of them surrendered because they had been injured in battle and no hospitals to take them. So they surrendered. We're getting all this fake news that Biden called him Putin, but it's Zelensky. They're losing the war. They will lose the war just out of attrition because Russia is vast and it has a plethora of soldiers, a greater army, and they will just win by numbers. But back to our Bible story. In this story, God is saying, I want my name declared throughout all the earth, verse 16. Look at verse 18. Behold, tomorrow, about this time, I will cause it to rain a very grievous hail, such as not been in Egypt since the foundation thereof, even until now. This is the seventh plague, the plague of hail. Someone sent me a picture last month of hail this big around that was in Texas. And of course, Texas being further south typically doesn't get a whole lot of hail, but it was massive. Hail falling from the heavens that big would crush any car, any windshield, destroy any roof. I mean, it is so destructive. And this is not a normal size hail, is it? Well, I think in Egypt, we don't know the size of the hail, but this was not a normal hailstorm because it says they had not seen one like this since the inception, meaning the very beginning of the Egyptian nation, all the way up to the present time of Moses. And what does hail do to them? Destroys structures, destroys crops, kills people, kills animals. I mean, it is so destructive. And that's what's going on. Look in the next verse, verse 19. Send therefore and gather thy cattle, and all that thou hast in the field, for upon every man and beast shall be found in the field, and shall not be brought home. The hail shall come down upon them, and they shall die. He that feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh made his servants and his cattle flee into the houses. We got now some Egyptians starting to believe. That's what's important here, is that God wanted them to know, I am the one true God. Pharaoh disbelieves. He has had numerous opportunities to obey, but instead he refuses, he tries to compromise, and God will have no compromise. That should be really a great lesson for us today. We are living in an era where people want to compromise with the Lord. Last Sunday morning, I preached a sermon talking about a do-it-yourself type religion where people claim that they're not religious, they're just spiritual. And they kind of worship God as what is right in their own eyes. And as a result of that, people say, I don't go to church, but I'm spiritual. I don't really read the Bible, but I'm spiritual. They don't do anything that God has commanded, but they have, to their own wisdom, compromised the will of God. And we notice that from all four Gospels, never once did Jesus say, go out and be spiritual, or grow your spirituality. He never said those things. He did want them to grow and mature in the faith, but he didn't call them to be spiritual. Let's look at the 8th plague. Verse 4 in chapter 10. Else if thou refuse to let my people go, behold, tomorrow I will bring the locusts into thy coast. Now, I used to think the locust was like what we have here in America. Locust has always been to me sort of like these July flies. You'd see their little shell left on, a lot of times it would be on thorn trees, but it could be on any tree. And I thought these are what came against Egypt, but it wasn't. This is grasshoppers. And you know what grasshoppers do? They eat. And what do they eat? Your crops, your grass, everything, to where there's nothing left for man or beast to enjoy. Now, they've already been devastated by the hail. There's very few crops left. And now there's this plague of grasshoppers. And it's not good. So it brings about a third compromise. Look in verse 10. And he said unto them, let the Lord be so with you, as I will let you go, and your little ones, look to it, for evil is before you. Not so go now, ye that are men, and serve the Lord, for that ye did desire, and they were driven out from Pharaoh's presence. Now, Pharaoh's saying, you can go, but don't take your little ones. Well, what parent's going to leave their child behind? This is unacceptable, so they're going to refuse, and it's going to bring forth a 9th plague. And by the way, sometimes these plagues, Pharaoh would call for Moses and say, will you take it away? And he would pray to the Lord God, and whatever plague it was, like the frogs, would be all gone the next day, which I think is really important. All right, verse 21. And the Lord said unto Moses, stretch out thine hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt. I want you to consider darkness for a moment. As children, I think we tend to be afraid of the dark. As a child, I was like Pharaoh with a hardened heart and stubborn. I was never afraid of the dark. But my brother and sister were. Most of the kids I played with were. And one of the fun tricks we used to do as a kid was take them snipe hunting. And we'd go, or snipe hunting, not snipe, but snipe. And we'd take them out away from the house in the dark with a flashlight and say, now you hold this paper bag and we're going to go chase the snipe towards you. And when he runs in the bag, you close it. Well, then we go off and leave them and don't come back. And we had a lot of kids crying and weeping and, all this kind of stuff. It was mean and it was wrong, and I'm sorry now. but I was just a kid. I didn't know any better. Thought it was funny. I always have enjoyed a good laugh. But when it's really dark, so dark that you can feel it, it's really uneasy, isn't it? We had a storm shelter built in the back of our yard. The only time my dad ever let me skip school was to build this storm shelter. I dug it out of a bank by hand and foot. We laid concrete there, blocked it up, had everything in concrete blocks except the front door. It was big enough that our 4 horses could get in it. And it was cold and damp in there because it was in the ground. It was 12 by 20 by 15 foot. So it was huge. And I can remember Dad saying, "Get up, we're going to the storm house." And being in there with that, we forgot either batteries. You ever notice on TV, people have a flashlight and all of a sudden it starts going dim and they start beating it like this and it don't work at all? Well, that's the way it was this one time we went to the storm house. So we're all 5 sitting there in the dark. We can't even see one another. Thundering outside. Every now and then you'd hear that. You couldn't see any light in there because there were no windows. It was dark. I mean, totally dark. And it was like a darkness that could be felt. Do you know hell itself is considered utter darkness? It's strange when you read about it because there's supposed to be this consuming fire, right? But yet it's utter darkness. And that's part of the terror of hell itself. It is so dark that these people cannot see each other. The dark can be felt. Look down in chapter 10, verse 28. Well, maybe I should read 24 and then we'll go to 28. Here's the 4th compromise in verse 24. "And Pharaoh called unto Moses and said, Go ye, serve the Lord. Only let your flocks and your herds be stayed. Let your little ones also go with you. Now you leave all your cattle and stuff here." Pharaoh knew that they were shepherds, that this is their livelihood. He also knew that they would need animals for sacrifice, so how could they leave them behind? This meant they could not worship and sacrifice as they should. So this is definitely a no, isn't it? Which will result in the 10th plague. But I want you to look at verse 28 with me. "And Pharaoh said unto him, Get thee from me. Take heed to thyself. See my face no more. For in that day thou seest my face, thou shalt die." Consider where Moses is at this point. You know, Moses in the beginning was somewhat immature, wasn't he? He said to God, "I'm not the man." God said, "I've chosen you." He said, "Who shall I say sent me?" He says, "They won't believe me." He says, "I am not eloquent." I mean, he has all of these excuses not to obey God. But now he is obeying God even in the face of death. Reminds me of Revelation 2:10, "Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life." Pharaoh has been given many opportunities, but he refuses. Sometimes we also are given many opportunities and we refuse the Lord. That's why I hate to bring it up sometimes in sermons, but there comes a time that God can give you over to a reprobate mind, which means you have the mind of an animal and it becomes somewhat a lost cause. And that is a warning, and we have to give that lest their blood be upon our hands. Here's the first great lesson I want you to take from tonight. And that is God is judging the gods of this world. Now, all the gods of that land, God proved they were false gods. And you may be thinking, well, what gods do we have today? Well, we've got the God of pleasure, right? We got the God of finance. We got the God of sports. We've got the God of the world, and most people love the world, which is enmity with God, James 4:4. In 1 John 2:15 through 17, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. For if any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world, and the world passeth away, and the lust thereof. This morning we talked about winning and people running the race, the Christian race. Those people ran for a laurel crown, which was just basically leaves that would wilt. They would be gone in a week. But we run a race for a life that is eternal. This was a great lesson that he brings out to the land of Egypt. Here's the second thing. God is waging a spiritual war. It's still going on today. In Ephesians 6:10 and following, he talks about to take on the weapons of our warfare. Because he says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in high places. He's talking about the gods of this world. And of course, Satan is pictured as the prince of the earth. And so how do we battle such gods? With the Word of God. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. That's how we defeat the false gods of this world. America's in love with the world. We're very hedonistic. The devil is raging. It's time that we get back to God, the true God of this world. Then God desires a response. You know, in all of these situations, when Moses is going to Pharaoh 9 times here, and he gives him opportunity after opportunity, and God knew what response he was going to get. I think as a gospel preacher, we know many times the response we are going to get too. Because many are called, few are chosen, right? Jesus says, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, but few come. Straight is the gate and narrow is the way. When we look at the parable of the soils in Luke chapter 8, 3 out of 4 fell away because of the gods of this world. They gave a favorable response in the beginning. They all received the seed, which is the Word of God, Luke 8:11. But because of the cares and pleasures and riches, they were compared to thorns and thistles and weeds that choked out what sprouted up in the name of God. It's not that the devil overcame God's children. It's that God's children gave in. In Romans 8, there's neither height nor depth nor breadth nor any such thing that can separate you from the love of God. Moses did as God commanded in each situation. Here's the next thing. God will be worshiped by all nations. You know, in the Philippian letter as well as Revelation, we find statements that every knee shall bow, every tongue shall confess. Those that will not, they pray in Revelation that the rocks will fall upon them to hide them from the presence of the Lord. But there's no escaping the Lord. And Pharaoh was in a situation where he could not escape the Lord. It's too bad that he couldn't be obedient. I want you to go back to chapter 9. I'd like to read a couple of verses and we'll close this lesson. I know it's been a long one. Chapter 9, verse 14 first. For I will at this time send all my plagues upon thine heart, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, that thou mayest know that there is none like me in all the earth. Look at verse 16. And in very deed for this cause have I raised thee up, to show thee my power, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth. Do you know that it is God's desire for you to declare God's name throughout all the earth? I mean, we often quote Mark 16:16, which says, "He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned." Why do we never put in verse 15, which says, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature"? It's because we fail sometimes in our obedience. But it is God's desire that we make his name great and let our light shine and become the salt of the earth, that we may win others to him. Paul's story about being a winner this morning was the fact that he became all things that he might by all means gain one soul. And that's the way we should be. So I'm going to close the lesson at this time. If there's any special needs, we ask that you make it known as together we stand and sing.
I'm satisfied with just enough below, a little silver and a little gold. But in that city where the rest will shine, I want a gold one, that silver line.